served as a legislative assistant and then chief of staff with Congressman Melvin Watts of the 12th Congressional District of North Carolina for nearly 14 years. And she is currently managing director in the Office of Government Affairs at Goldman Sachs. Joyce is responsible for a whole host of initiatives, but particularly one that I thought was of good point for today's conversation was that she's serving as the liaison for the Office of Corporate Engagement to lead outreach efforts on Capitol Hill's stakeholders and promoting corporate citizenship programs. Welcome, Joyce. Hopefully I didn't mess up your intro too much, but we're really excited to have you join us.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you so much, Joe, and great to have everyone join us today. It's my pleasure to be here, and I have the distinct pleasure and honor of introducing Bill Adair. Bill he is the Knight Professor of the Practice of Journalism and Public Policy at the Sanford School of Public Policy. He was appointed to this current professorship in 2013, and he's one of 25 Knight chairs at universities around the country. He's a director of the DeWitt Wallace Center for Media and Democracy. He was the creator of the Pulitzer Prize winning website PolitiFact, the largest fact-checking effort in history. He's a leader in fact-checking in digital media. I found this so amazing and impressive, particularly in the work that I do here in Washington and working with Capitol Hill. And I just think we are just so honored to have him spend some time with us, tell us about how he got into this business. He did work for 24 years as a reporter and editor for Tampa Bay Times before he transitioned to academia in 2003. And he's written some really interesting articles, and I've just so enjoyed having the chance to get to know him, not only through his writing, but through preparation for this session. And Bill, welcome. We're so honored to have you today.
Thank you so much, Joyce. It's great to be here, and great to be here with such a big group, and thrilled to talk a little bit about some of the things that I tell my students and some of the lessons that I've learned along the way in journalism and political fact-checking, and some of the things that I think we can do in how we consume media to make us better informed and also keep us sane, because I think we have more media than ever that we can consume, but that is not necessarily a good thing. So it'll be fun today to talk about that.
Well, great, and you're so right. I think we've all experienced information overload in many ways, but particularly during the pandemic, just trying to keep up with everything that's happening, what we should be doing, what we shouldn't be doing. But let's talk a little bit about your background, your experience. Tell us how you ended up getting into journalism in the first place.
You bet. Well, so, I got into journalism because my mother told me to. When I was about 12 years old, my mother said, "You should be a reporter. And, we should always do what our parents tell us to do." And she was right. In 8th grade, I did my career report on journalism. And I actually show in my classes, I show a slide of my original career report from 8th grade, in which I say that a reporter is not very well paid. And that a reporter has to be curious about things and needs to want to find things out. And that's very true. And that's one of the things that I tell our students here in the DeWitt Wallace Center, that to be a journalist is to have a license to be curious. You have this wonderful job where every day you get to go out and ask people questions, be curious about things, and then tell their story. And it's I don't even think of it as a job. It's so much fun. I've done it really going back to high school, and I've loved every minute of it. And so it's been great. So I got into it because of my mom. And the movie All the President's Men really inspired me. I was impressed that journalism could have an impact. That, of course, was the story of Woodward and Bernstein and how they uncovered the Watergate scandal. It taught me that journalism could have an impact. It also showed me how good looking reporters could be. I wanted to be as good looking as Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman, particularly Robert Redford in that brown corduroy suit. And I thought, man, if I could look good in that brown corduroy suit. So that's what got me started. When I was in college, I studied political science at Arizona State University, and I actually did an independent study my senior year in college on fact checking and the need to fact check politicians. And back then, this is 1985, that was a radical concept because journalists didn't do that. Journalists didn't say when politicians said something that was false. Journalists just reported the news. And I said in my independent study, this is what journalists should start doing. And I wish I could say that it had an impact. No one read it except Ruth Jones, my American politics professor, but a very smart journalist named David Broder, who was a columnist of the Washington Post, had the same idea. And in 1988 and 89, he wrote some columns that led to the beginning of the political fact-checking movement in the United States that sort of paved the way for what I would do later when I started PolitiFact in 2007. So I was ahead of my time and ahead of even David Broder. But it all sort of came true, and I ended up doing political fact checking.
So tell me a little bit more. Let's unpack that a little bit. I think what's interesting is when you reference David Broder, and you said that was around 1985 to 2007 to now. I mean, what trends? What has changed? Why did David Broder think that it was necessary then? In terms of, were there particular, let's call them, politicians or people that would say things that people either automatically knew weren't actually the truth at the time, or over time? I think because we have this 24-hour real-time access to information at all time, when you look at from that time to when you started Fact Checked until now, it's 2021. Talk a little bit about how that whole process has evolved, but why was it necessary, and what sort of drove that until we experienced, I think, today where, you hear all these sound bites, you get these short, media blurbs from Twitter or wherever, and it's hard to know what's actually true until you get in a situation where you have long political speeches or political debates, and then you are able to process and synthesize the information a little bit differently while you're watching that. So I'd love to just hear kind of your thoughts on looking back and how we've moved forward and why it's so important today.
Sure. So if you think back to how we got news in the 1960s and 1970s, there were filters. And those filters were the three television networks, and there were just three really, ABC, NBC, and CBS. And you belonged to one network almost. Like my family was an NBC family, and my dad would come home and sit in front of the TV, and he would watch Huntley Brinkley. We were an NBC family, and the television networks and a few newspapers and the wire services, the news wires like the Associated Press and United Press International, were the filters, and they filtered the news. So that was good in that it filtered out the crazy. So if we think about conspiracy theories, we know they've been around forever. But back then, things like wacky theories about whatever, the Kennedy assassination, got filtered out by the news media. And with just a few outlets, that was easy to do. And I was actually part of the filter. When I was in high school, I worked for the local paper. We would get letters from people who were not really stable, and they would have wacky conspiracy theories. I would open the mail. I would hand the mail to the city editor, and she would throw the mail away. So that would get rid of the conspiracy theories. So the media acted as a useful filter. Now, there were downsides to that. Who was making these decisions? Largely white guys. So that was not a good thing. There was not a lot of diversity in the decisions that were getting made. But one upside of it was filtering out the crazy, and the people who were sending those letters to us at the newspaper had no way to connect. So the person who would send some wacky theory wasn't connecting with the people who had a similar wacky theory. Well, things changed, of course, and today all those people can connect and have a megaphone that really gives them an outsized voice with their falsehoods. And that's why fact-checking is necessary. Now, I was, I wouldn't say ahead of my time, but the early political ads in the 1980s began to really spread political exaggerations and political falsehoods, and they needed to be fact-checked. And there were a few people who realized that. David Broder, Kathleen Hall Jamieson. Kathleen Hall Jamieson is a brilliant scholar at the University of Pennsylvania, and she deserves a lot of credit as really one of the pioneers of political fact-checking. She's still going strong today. So that led to the political fact-checking movement. And then once the internet started, it became easier to do a couple of things. One, to research political claims in ways we never could before. We could get bills, we could get votes, we could get original documents for fact checks that would take days before. It used to be if you wanted a bill in Congress, you had to go to a clerk's office in the bowels of the Capitol building, and now you can get it instantly. But you can also distribute the fact checking much more quickly. So, but you can also spread the falsehoods a lot more quickly.
Yeah. How do you distribute? Talk to us a little bit about that and what you all are doing with PolitiFact. How does that work?
You bet. So we've I think we're sort of we're at a moment where we need to find new ways to do that and do it better. So when we started, we distributed like any other website would. We published on the web, and that was cool. And people came to us and read our fact checks. And then we told people about the fact checks on Facebook and on Twitter, and that was great. And then I would go on MSNBC and talk about them, and I'd go on CNN and talk about them. And for a while, I went on Fox and talked about them until suddenly Fox didn't seem that interested in having me on anymore. Interesting. So, but it's clear now more than ever that there's a divide in this country, and this isn't going to surprise anyone, that there are people who seek out fact checks, and there are people who and then there are people who are going to reject fact checks. And I think there's a pretty strong correlation that the people who need the fact checks are the people who are not going to seek them out. So here in the DeWitt Wallace Center, in the Duke Reporters Lab that I run, we've been experimenting with different ways to try to get fact checks to people. How can we do that? So one way is to get it onto your television, onto your video screen, onto your browser. And so we've developed a product that really is like a dream come true for me. When I started PolitiFact in 2007, very quickly, people started to talk to me about an idea that was a dream. And the idea was you'd be watching a campaign speech or a debate, and somehow your app or your technology would detect what the politician was saying. It would match with a fact check, and the fact check would pop up on the screen and say, that was false. Wouldn't that be cool if that could really happen?
That would be.
It does. We've done it. Here at Duke, we have built a technology that does that. It's called Squash, and it works pretty well. We use the same technology that your phone uses, voice to text. We detect what the politician says. We match it against a giant database of fact checks. And if there's a fact check that matches, we pop it up on the screen. So we've fulfilled my dream, except that we still have some problems. One is voice to text isn't so great. We know this when we talk to our phone, and it does goofy translations. Also, the matches aren't perfect. Sometimes it misses matches or it proposes bad ones. So we've brought humans into the equation to refine those matches. Another challenge is there just aren't enough fact checks. The fact checkers don't produce enough. And then finally, what do we display on the screen? This is maybe the hardest challenge. How do you tell people, hey, that statement you just heard 30 seconds ago is related to this fact check that was published 2 weeks ago on the slightly different claim that was rated half true by the Washington Post or whatever. So that's a lot to convey on a screen of your phone in a dynamic situation. So we've been working on that. We've had some great success, but we've had some wins. So great progress. We've been working with Google and Facebook on this new standard. I think we're getting some feedback there. But that still is not going to convince a certain segment of the population about facts. You've got, what's the falsehood of the week? It's this claim about that the climate plan is going to make people have to stop eating burgers. Well, having a fact check pop up on your TV screen is not going to stop people from believing that, even though it's false. We have deeper problems, and we're working on all those, though. So anyway, I'm excited. We continue to make great progress here in our reporters lab on these things. And I'm very enthusiastic about the kind of energy that's happening in journalism and tech on these efforts.
And do you think that that's something that we would then be able to, any of us at, how would we, the general public, be able to access that in terms of watching a particular show, or how do you all see that evolving?
So right now, our product Squash is still in an experimental mode. We have not gone public with it because it's not reliable enough. We did, with PolitiFact, a partnership with WRAL TV, which is the NBC affiliate here in the Raleigh-Durham area. And they did a manual version of this during a couple of the presidential debates, where they actually did live fact checking of the debate. And they did a really good job. And they overcame, I think, pretty well the what do you display problem. Now, the presidential campaign is easy to do because there were so many fact checks of Trump and Biden. Our problem, we did a test the other day of President Biden, and the fact checkers have not done enough fact checks of him. So now we'll see tonight. We're going to try again. We'll do a private test of his speech to Congress tonight. But at this point, we don't have a public product. We're still in the tinkering mode.
Well, I think it'll be interesting, as you said, to watch the speech tonight. And I think what will obviously be helpful is that you'll get the transcript in writing, so that should facilitate being able to decipher that information in real time. I think one of the things you talked about in terms of the importance of fact checking and why people are so thirsty from it, I appreciated what you said in terms of the networks being a filter and yet you have people who are skeptical no matter what. And if you're a Fox person versus you're a NBC person now with all the cable networks, or you a CNN person, um, there's a lot of mistrust of the information and mistrust of the media. And I think that was amplified, that messaging, um, over the last several years, particularly in politics, in with the presidency, et cetera, elections and all. Talk to us a little bit about this question. Polls constantly show that people don't trust the media and they think that it's biased. Biased, it's hard to say, is it biased based on just the people that you have that are doing the reporting? I mean, there is a difference when you're having a commentator, you have a Rachel Maddow or someone who's expressing their views and their observations versus actual reporting, news reporting, covering what candidates are saying. So talk to us a little bit about this or this question or challenge of trust in the media, and is the media biased, and how can we build confidence or rebuild confidence in that? And I think that obviously this fact checking process and ability to do so is probably very important in that process.
So I'm really glad you brought up the difference between a commentator like Rachel Maddow, or I would add an opinion columnist like Frank Bruni, who we just hired here in our journalism program, or Ross Douthat, or George Will. Those are opinion columnists. So yes, surveys show people believe the media is biased. And I think that reflects a lack of understanding about the different types of journalism. Opinion journalism, columns, commentators on television are, of course, biased. Their opinion, that's what we want from opinion journalism. We read columnists so we can learn their opinions. What I think news organizations need to do better is label the different types of content. And so what I do in my courses, in every course I teach, is I teach the what I call Bill's continuum of journalism. And the continuum of journalism goes from news on one end to opinion on the other. And then in the middle are things such as fact-checking and analysis. So news, we know what that is. That should be pretty much straight, factual, without without a point of view from the writer. Now, it's going to contain the opinions of the people who are quoted in it. So you might have a Republican quoted in it, you might have a Democrat quoted in it. It's going to contain their opinions, but it's going to be a news story. In the middle, I put fact-checking, which I consider to be reported conclusion journalism. So that is an article where a journalist has done research about a factual claim and then made a determination if the politician is accurate or not. So they may say that claim is false, but they have used objective methods to make that determination. So that would be in the middle. Analysis would be a similar kind of journalism where they are assessing, they are analyzing something that happened without giving an opinion of it. And then on the other end would be opinion journalism. What the president did was bad. So that's the continuum of journalism. So where does the media need to improve? They need to tell people about these different types. They need to label this journalism, and they have not been doing that. And I think that very well. And I think that's an area where they could gain a lot of trust if they would just use common labels. There have been a couple of efforts to try to do this. They have not gone well. There are a variety of things. Google could provide some incentives to publishers to do this. They haven't done that as much as they could. There's an effort called the Trust Project that has tried to develop standards for publishers. That hasn't caught on the way it could. But this is something that I really think could help a lot.
You've given us a lot to think about, and I see there's a couple of questions that are popping up in the chat, so we'll come back to that. Before we move to open the Q&A to the audience, I really am interested, it's just such a fascinating time, and to be a student, even though it's been a particularly difficult time over the past year, given COVID and everyone having to work remotely or take classes remotely. Tell us a little bit about what your students in the classroom are most focused on. I mean, since they're our next generation of journalists, I think it's encouraging to know, first of all, that they have the opportunity to take these types of classes and study and learn from you. But what are they focused on? What are they most concerned about? And then what are you hopeful of as you look at this current, your students that are, I guess, a number, freshmen through seniors at this time, as they look into moving into journalism or a career in communications or potentially public policy or politics. Tell us a little bit about your experience with these students right now.
Sure. So I'll tell a couple of stories out of the past year. In the fall, I taught a course, our advanced reporting seminar, where we have a small group of students, eight students who are reporters for our publication, the 9th Street Journal, which is our student publication in the DeWitt Wallace Center. And they covered the election and campaigns in North Carolina. And they did it largely remotely, but they really got into it. And what was remarkable to me was how much they were able to do and adapt to the pandemic. So we had one student covering a congressional race down in Fayetteville, but the student happened to be home in Des Moines. And you would think that she was in Fayetteville at the Fort Bragg Base Exchange talking to people. She did such a marvelous job reporting this. Her name is Maya Miller. And she was just tremendous. And she covered that race better than any journalist in the state of North Carolina. And there was no one else who knew anything. She had a couple of scoops. And it was testament to, one, how anybody, if you just are persistent, you can get into a story, but also just to Maya's persistence and skills as a journalist. It was just so impressive. And that was the case with all of our student journalists in the fall covering the election, that they were not intimidated by the challenging times. They managed to do a lot by phone and Zoom to safely tell the story of this crazy election. So I was so impressed by their persistence. And I think what motivates them is the desire to inform people and tell people what's going on. And that in this important state with some key races, they wanted to tell that story. And our stories were published not just in the 9th Street Journal, they were also published in Indie Week, the alt weekly here, and in some other publications as well. And so it was just some great journalism. And then this semester, we did an experimental course that was kind of a lab. I'm writing a book about lying in politics. And so I taught a course about lying in politics. And I had 13 students who joined me for this adventure. And the idea was to do a variety of assignments, partly using data, some data that we had created in a partnership with Google about fact checks, and partly by just studying falsehoods in the political discourse, to just explore how politicians lie and what happens with those lies. And this class was not as much a journalism class as it was a political science class. So this drew on my background in political science. And as I began this class, I asked one of my students, who I'm very close to, what his favorite classes were. And he said, it's classes where the professor learns along with the students. And that was very much the case here, because although I had a very well-developed syllabus, I was definitely learning because I'm gathering material for this book I'm writing. And the students were like scouts in the wilderness, and they went out and they found all these interesting things that I hadn't dreamed of that now will be part of the book. At one point, I had a guest speaker who said to the students that they should insist that their 13 names appear on the cover of the book as co-authors. So they were amazing. Their papers were so creative. At the end, one of the options for the final assignment was they were to devise a system to discourage lying by politicians, either a public policy change, a change by one of the tech platforms like Facebook, or something in campaign finance. And they came up with some really creative solutions, some of which I will develop in the book. And with, of course, full credit for them. They were just tremendous. So anyway, they completely rose to the occasion. So I'm so fortunate to work with such talented students. They particularly in that class, they just dazzled me.
Wonderful. Well, I love so much hearing that, because it makes me want to be a student again, but it also gives us a little faith and confidence in our future journalists. And we look forward so much to the book being published and released. What's the timing of when do you expect to have
well, I think we're probably a year and a half away, if I had to guess.
I'm not rushing you. I'm not. But well, look, I think this is a good place, Bill. I could go on and on just on my own personal interests, but we are fortunate to have so many participants on the Zoom, and I think we'll try to turn to the chat. Joe, I'm looking at the chat, and but maybe keep me honest. And there's an interesting question that just came in. It's the last question that was the most recent question, I should say, that was submitted. But I wondered if Thomas Bruckmeyer would like to speak and make his point and question, talk to us rather than me just reading it from the chat. Thomas, are you available? Would you like to talk to Bill directly? You're on mute, Thomas.
Okay, should be working now. Good. The question is, I've been following the discussion about media and fact checking for a while. And we know that media landscape has changed dramatically. Lots of news is delivered through various, mostly electronically based media. And many news outlets went away from subscription models in a chasing ads and clicks type of model, which creates an incentive that is basically based on the more clicks you get, the more views you get, the more money you make, which, that's a legit thing to do. But it promotes emotions over facts and content. The more outrageous, and we see that everywhere we look, whether it's Twitter, Facebook, and so forth, the more outrageous the supposed content is, and I use content in quotes here, the more likely it is to generate revenue, which can create a very, very bad set of incentives because it totally neglects any drive for truth and content. How can that be overcome in the near future?
Thanks, Thomas. That's a great question. In one sense, it's that incentive has always been there, right? I mean, it's been there. You know, we've had, if we go back to some of the early newspapers, that was one of the complaints, that they were selling, you know, they were scandal sheets and they were sensationalizing the news. But you're right that what's different now is that it hits that impulse that we have, like, oh, let's see that. Ooh, I want to see that terrible thing. Ooh, you know, and so it seems to appeal to our worst instincts. So what's interesting is I've seen that fade a little bit recently, particularly as the market for advertising has gotten glutted. So originally, the ad rates were such that news organizations could charge a higher rate for advertising, and clicks were worth more. They're not worth as much anymore, and so that pursuit isn't quite as hot as it used to be. And now the new trend is more to get subscriptions, or what many publications will just call membership. And that seems to be the way to elevate the caliber of journalism, by requiring that you subscribe. And we've all encountered this because we hit those paywalls, as they call them, when, you know, you read one article and then you go to read a second, and it'll often say, you know, to read this article, you need to subscribe, and it only costs 99 cents a month. But a lot of us are getting tired of that because we can't subscribe to every publication that we click on. And so now we have to think about more of a all-you-can-eat model that might give you access to multiple publications, so that you can maybe read a whole bunch of newspapers and magazine sites. And I'm hopeful maybe that's where we're headed, and that might address your clickbait concern. But the other thing that I think needs to change is publications need to differentiate between, if you subscribe, get rid of the ads. You know, I mean, I think we all get frustrated if you subscribe to your local paper online, that you're still getting flooded with all these ads. You know, I subscribe to my former paper, the Tampa Bay Times, and if I don't have an ad blocker on, the ads are just choking off the content. You can barely find anything to read on the screen.
Yeah, that's definitely a challenge I think that we all face, and you don't want to miss the information, but the ads can really be annoying. We have several questions and comments from Mark Tannenbaum. Mark, are you able to come on and ask your question and speak to Bill live? We'd love to hear from you directly. Mark?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. I'm not sure I can remember all my questions. That's the problem. So I would rather you just choose and select the ones that are you think might be of interest to the.
Okay, sure. Well, thank you for that. Well, Bill, one of Mark's questions was, isn't it unrealistic to expect media to label their reporting properly as news versus commentary on a voluntary basis? Would Congress mandate this? Would the far right label this an interference with free speech? A voluntary system to label media info is unlikely, don't you think? So you talked a little bit about that, but I don't know if you have anything else you'd like to share. I mean, those are great questions, but hard to answer.
You bet. Well, thanks, Mark. I think, I don't think mandating is the way. I get nervous anytime people talk about mandating anything with news organizations, or or the press. But I think incentives can help. And I think Google and Facebook and Twitter and Instagram can provide those incentives. And here's what I would do. So Google wields huge market power here and can incentivize labels by saying to publishers, if you use labels, we will give you higher priority in Google News, or we will give you higher search rankings in Google search. And I think that's the way to do it. And that's actually the kind of thing my students, that's the kind of approaches that several of my students took in the Lying in Politics course. The politicians with the best record got more favorable treatment in various ways.
Bill, I do remember my most recent question that I thought would be an interesting incentive. Starting my video. I can't start my video, sorry. All right, so if when your squash media software for TV becomes a product that's available, I was thinking that a very brief icon, like a Pinocchio icon, with the length of the nose being proportional to the truth of the statement. And this would be the incentive. If your software could identify the media advertisers associated with the false news in time and just list the graphic representing the product, with the implication that a representation of false news has been sponsored by Ivory Soap, as an example, the public, if they chose to, could choose a different soap. I mean, really what's going to affect this is the flow of dollars, right? And you're thinking of Facebook, et cetera, offering positive incentives to utilize it. But if the public sees a product line that is affiliated in time with the false news, they might choose to avoid the product.
Yeah, I'm with you, Mark. I used to be, if you had asked me that question 2 years ago, I would have said, no, that's too activist for me, and fact checkers should just publish their fact checks and get out of the way. But now I'm with you, because I think that news organizations have a responsibility to stop airing this bogus stuff. And I do think the advertisers are, is one way to do it. And so, like, I think this means that My Pillow guy is going to get a big Pinocchio. Yeah, and if you look at, there's great fact check to read on PolitiFact, written by one of our alums, Bill McCarthy, about this whole burger silliness. And it originated with the Daily Mail, and then it got spread by Fox News. And so we can't deny that the news organizations are, blameless in this. These falsehoods are originating with media organizations, and they're being spread by media organizations as well as politicians. And I'm no longer at the, hey, fact checkers should sit on their hands. I think as a society, we have to be more activist against all this falsehoods. We saw in January that lies brought our democracy to its knees, and we just can't have that. So I'm with you.
Yeah, that's a great questions and very thoughtful response. I see a very interesting question from Jill Bayer Kipperin. I hope I pronounced your name correctly, Jill. She says, has the FCC ever shown interest in your real-time fact checking? And then I'll throw in, there's one other question from Deborah Pemberton, and she's really just asking about the fact that, she says neutrality seems to be gone, and how can you fact check in real time? We've talked a little bit about that. She says it seems to really find out if something is factual and to be detailed would take time. So I just think I am interested in your views on whether or not the FCC has ever shown interest
You
in.
bet. You bet. I can tackle both. So as far as I know, the FCC has not. And, you know, it's important to remember, and my colleague Phil Napoli is a much better expert on the FCC. But as far as I know, you know, the FCC's limited in what it can regulate. It's not regulating cable. It's really limited to the airwaves. And it's, as I understand what it regulates in political advertising, it only, its reach is limited to ads by independent expenditure groups. It doesn't do anything for candidate committees. So it's, and even then, the independent expenditure groups only have to show some effort that they did for fact checking their ads, not necessarily prove. And so the whole thing is pretty weak, which may be fine. You know, frankly, getting back to my whole freedom of speech commitment, I don't know that we want the government messing in that whole thing anyway. I like journalism checking this, not the government. And Joyce, what was the second part? My mind is numb from the end of the semester. We just had LDOC.
I understand. I think that, let me just try to find it. She was really just trying to say is, you know.
Oh, squash in real time. Yes.
Okay.
How could we do real time? Great question. And I should clarify what squash is matching. So squash hears what somebody said, and then it matches it to a previously published fact check. So that's great when politicians repeat their lines. Well, they do that all the time. You know, one of my demos has Elizabeth Warren repeating nearly verbatim a statement that she made that had been fact checked, and it was true. She got a true from PolitiFact. So that that matching is what our matching algorithm can do well, but it has to have been previously fact checked. What cannot be done yet, and I don't think it can be done in the near future, is an instant fact check. Because if you think about what has to happen for a fact check, you hear the claim, then the claim has to be researched, and then a judgment has to be made. Well, how accurate was that? Then that assessment has to be written. Well, can artificial intelligence do that? No, not yet. Closest that anyone has come, excuse me, a British group, Full Fact, is able to do this cool demo that if you say unemployment is going up, it will trigger a database query of unemployment statistics. So, but you know, we're a long way from a bot writing a fact check.
Well, we're nearing the end of the time. Let's see. I'm gonna check the chat again. Chris Chang asked, how can we address fake news that are promoted and go viral via non-traditional sources such as social media like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, etc.? Should social media companies be held responsible to be transparent with their algorithms? And I think you've written about this.
Sure, and I'll answer this question by first disclosing that the Reporters Lab has gotten funding from Google and Facebook, just so you know there's a relationship there. But I'll also say, yes, they should be transparent. I think that they could be a lot more transparent than they are about these things. And they could all do a lot more. Really interesting and worth reading. BuzzFeed broke a revealed an internal Facebook document a couple of days ago about their efforts to respond to the Stop the Steal movement. And it reveals a lot about what Facebook was doing behind the scenes. So I do think there's more that can be done there. It's really, and this is where, like, this class that I just taught, I'm not saying Duke students ought to run the world, but my students came up with some really creative ideas. Now, it was a narrow focus. Let's discourage politicians from lying. How can we do that? But just on that front, there were some really cool ideas. And one of them used Facebook ad rates. So the politicians with the best records for fact checking get lower ad rates from Facebook.
Wow.
What a cool incentive. Like, you could see that working. So anyway, I think incentives are often the best way. Incentives seem more effective to me often than penalties in deleting content.
Well, I think we have time for one last question, but I'm going to roll two in, and then hopefully you'll have a chance to get to them before we need to move to closing remarks. Thea asks, do politicians ever ask to have their speeches fact-checked beforehand? Just because I've worked for a member of Congress and work with them constantly, I had to get that one in. And then let me just ask you to conclude with, what advice do you have for people about consuming media in this chaotic time? And what are some of your media habits in terms of digesting and reading and
Sure.
processing?
So we did have at various times politicians that would approach us and say, would we kind of pre-fact check an ad? And we would not. We just didn't feel that was appropriate for a journalism organization. And I think, you get into just what is the role of a news organization, and that just seemed like it was, even for a non-traditional organization like PolitiFact, that seemed like that was crossing a line to me. So, and even though, in my answer to Mark's question, I'm evolving on how I feel about how activist fact checkers ought to be. I don't think we should pre-approve ads. My media habits. So this too has been changing a little bit. So we've all got phones. We're getting news alerts. We're on our computers all day long. We can get news constantly. Isn't that great? No. I'm now. So, and I should explain my current status with PolitiFact. I was helping to edit PolitiFact North Carolina through the election. And then now that I'm working on the book, I have begged off that so that I can focus on the book. And so I don't have any current role with PolitiFact. And that's also allowed me to take a more normal media consumption habit. And I recommend this to everybody. And that is, don't check the news throughout the day. At least I don't. I might look at the news. I'll look at Twitter throughout the day more to see what journalists are saying about journalism, not so much to see what the big headlines are. But I really don't consume news much during the day. I read it once a day in the morning. And I've gone back to reading a print newspaper. And I find that to be a really calm, thoughtful point in my day when I can really read the news and reflect. And I don't find that I'm missing anything significant. The news is summarized for me nicely in the print newspaper. and I don't feel like the fact that I haven't turned on cable the previous day, that I haven't kept up with every alert, is robbing me of anything. Now I'm still getting alerts on my phone, so I don't want to make it seem like I've turned into a Luddite, living in a log cabin somewhere, waiting for the horse and buggy to bring my print newspaper. But I do think this idea of reading the news once a day brings sanity to my life. The other thing I do, and I tell my students this, I make a point of reading every day a columnist that I disagree with. And I think this is really important toward a civil discourse, that we can't just read and listen to people that we like and agree with. And I think it's important to have people that, you just are like, well, I don't really agree with that, but I'll read it. I read one a couple days ago and I was like, there's some good points in there. Other days I read it and I think, there's nothing in this one I like. But it's good to know what people are talking about that I don't agree with. And so I recommend that to everyone. And I think that can make for a richer understanding of everyone, and I hope return us to a civil discourse.
I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you so much, Bill, for those sage pieces of advice. And I really enjoyed having this conversation with you. I look forward to tracking your fact-checking more. And this concludes our conversation, and I'll turn it back over to Joe for concluding remarks. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Joyce and Bill. Amazing, fascinating conversation. Hopefully everyone in our audience found something that they could take away from today so that you can continue being an engaged citizen and news savvy at the same time.